This conversation is part of an interview project through the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. We're speaking with Yale alumni in order to more deeply understand the hearts and minds of those who work at the intersection of spiritual leadership and environmental action. Today, we are grateful to be joined by Dr. Greg Hitzhusen. Greg is Assistant Professor of Professional Practice in Religion, Ecology, and Sustainability at The Ohio State University School of Environment and Natural Resources. He sits on the steering team of the Center for Ethics and Human Values at OSU and was founding director and board chair of Ohio Interfaith Power and Light. His teaching and research focus on the intersection of faith and environment, building sustainable communities, and partnerships between scientific and faith communities. I'd love to start kind of at your entry point to this. Take us to the beginning. How did this your work at this intersection and your passion for this intersection kind of get sparked?
Yeah, well, I always say I kind of grew up in the garden, and that was probably the beginnings for me. My parents were both farm kids from northern Iowa, and I always joke that they didn't really know how to raise a child except on a farm. So we had a 4-acre sort of hobby farm that I grew up on, and lots of gardens. And my mom was a organic gardener before it was popular, and we were somewhat on the self-sufficiency path, if you will. So I spent a lot of time planting things, growing things, composting things, all of that. At the same time, my dad was a professor of ecological economics, and he studied things like acid mine tailings in Ohio. And so for me, dinner time conversation, I thought it was normal to talk about things like acid rain at the dinner table. And and so about the time I was in middle school, growing up in Ohio, we were the source of that high sulfur coal that was causing sulfuric acid to fall from the skies in the Adirondacks and the Canadian Maritime provinces. And I figured that out as a middle schooler, just was like, wait a second, when I turn on the light switch, sulfuric acid is falling in Canada? Like, wait, what? And that just seemed at the most basic moral level to be wrong. Like my
Mhm.
middle school mind was like, that's wrong. You got to do something about that.
Mhm.
And that really sparked my environmental interests, I think, in the first place. And from that, I started to think, I guess I should study the environment. I should study ecology. So I had that as a starting point as I was going to go off to college. But I also had sort of a family backstory. One of my grandfathers, when he retired off the farm, went into soil conservation. And I always think of him, he was sort of an Aldo Leopoldish kind of person. And he was actually chosen as the subject for a documentary film about farming as a way of life.
Mhm.
John Deere and Company, the tractor company,
Wow.
went out to my grandfather's farm and
Mm.
documented the transition as he was handing over the farm to his son, one of my uncles. And it turns out that my grandfather was sort of a philosopher farmer, and he would kind of stand back and say, well, like the closing line from the film was, really, we're just tenants on the land, and if we can leave it a little bit better than we found it,
Mm.
it'll live on for the next generation. And that was a good description of my grandfather. Was he was a Methodist layman, but he never wore his faith on his sleeve. You wouldn't have known. It was kind of like the roots of him that were underground. You don't necessarily see it, but that quote is, I think, from Leviticus. I think that. So there was this sense that we were here to be articulate caretakers of the land that was sort of inculcated into me from my family story. So
Mm.
add that to a lot of time on the land gardening things. We were a family that when we did go on vacation, it was always to a campground somewhere. And so I had a lot of experience in contact with the natural world that all made sense. But then that moment of acid rain, that seems wrong, kind of spurred me to learn more about ecology. So I went off to college to study ecology. And I think kind of what happened to me there was um, most of my environmental science professors told me this story that the reason that the earth was degraded was because of biblical ideas about dominion. It was the sort of the Lynn White thesis, if you will, from the late 60s was definitely part of the message I picked up from my ecology and environmental science professors. They all seemed to believe that that was really true. And I guess it just sort of like I figured it must be true as well, but there was also a little bit of cognitive dissonance for me. I always sort of felt like something's not quite right about that story because I don't know. I mean, in my own, the most conservationist person I know is my grandfather, and he's a Methodist layman, and his faith is actually why he cares about that stuff. Like,
Mhm.
didn't quite add up for me. So I thought a lot about those kinds of things, and then when I graduated with my degree, I ended up taking a job with the National Wildlife Federation in their outdoor ethics division to help create a program called Nature Link, where the idea was to connect people more closely to the natural world. In the context of families with mentors in sort of a weekend sort of event. Um, and as we were building that program, it dawned on me that, I wonder if there's a way to incorporate people's religion or spirituality into a family program like this. And in fact, part of the idea was, there could be a lot of families that don't want to come to a weekend program because, they'll be missing church or something like
Mm,
that.
right.
Maybe we should offer something, a little optional thing on the side so that they won't feel like they're missing that and they can do a little bit of that at this program. So we started this sort of non-denominational devotional service that was optional on the Sunday morning of these weekend program, these Nature Link programs we were running for National Wildlife Federation. And it was there and in the preparations for that that it really struck me that not only was this sort of, whether I'd noticed it or not, this was a part of who I was because of my own heritage of families that took their faith somewhat seriously, but at the same time caring a lot about the environment. And when I helped put together these devotional services together with the local hosts of the various programs we were running, I saw these amazing, diverse expressions of really deeply held values where when people came sort of in prayer or in a offering up just a hope for, something, or just, their expressions of the beauty of the life that they were living in and what they're thankful for. I guess that's sort of spiritual dimensions of the way people contextualize the fact that they were at this Nature Link program was really deep and
Mm,
profound for me. I came
mhm,
out of that and I thought, oh my gosh, I need to spend more time figuring that out.
mm,
And I think that was a real key moment for me that sort of resonated with a lot of who I was, but also with some of the cognitive dissonance I'd been wrestling with through my undergraduate studies in ecology. It was like, maybe I need to learn more about how faith traditions and theology and spirituality might connect with environmental ethics, if you will, environmental
mhm,
ethics and environmental education. So that's the point at which I thought, I need to study this. And yet at the time, this was like the mid 1990s. So there were zero graduate programs in religion and ecology. It didn't exist yet.
yeah.
Mary Evelyn and John had not started the series at Harvard that, I always think of as sort of formally helping launch the field of religion and ecology. And so I spent 2 years, traveling around to different places trying to figure out where could I go to grad school and kind of study eco-theology, if you will. Or I was really actually curious about this question of like, are biblical traditions really ecologically bankrupt, or is there something there? Like,
Mhm,
let me look at those traditions and see if there's something more.
right.
And after 2 years of searching in different places, that's how I ended up at Yale Divinity School. I'd been to places where, it's a bit of a challenge, and yeah, there are people that teach courses on that kind of a thing. But when I walked into YDS and talked about what I'd love to be able to study, the response was, oh, well, if you think you can study those things here, we'll help you do that.
Mm,
And I suddenly realized that there was a really rich intellectual environment where I could dive in and try to learn more. And that I guess that at that point I was very formally on a path to being engaged in religion and the environment, not just kind of as something that related to my own personal background, but also something that was becoming my professional future.
mhm, mhm.
And things developed from there. So
Yeah.
it's been a long time taking shape, I guess, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm appreciative of you taking us through that. And it's really cool to hear just kind of how even really from the beginning, so deeply intertwined with this sense of ethical obligation um and yeah, personal connection, both. So So I'm kind of curious to go towards sort of the this exploration and work that you've done in your teaching and in your other work, and kind of ask sort of you to talk a little bit about how you see religion, both religious community, but also religious values, spirituality, kind of a whole range of options there, but see religion kind of influencing both environmental outlook or relationship, worldview, and also behavior
Yeah.
in your own life, in the US more broadly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's just a little question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, my starting point to even try to respond to that is just to say, obviously, it's very complex. Even in my own life, it's sort of multifaceted, multi-layered. You talk about worldviews and the way we see the world, and it's very clear that our larger worldviews, we're not always even fully aware of what they are. It's hard to make that explicit sometimes. And even if we can identify the things we think we believe, we may not hold those beliefs consistently over our lifetime, or those
Right.
beliefs will evolve and change. And I think that's been true in my own experience around a certain core. I think that I've returned to, but writ large for my own interest in the land. So I often talk about the religious landscape or the environmental values landscape of, say America, North America, or the world for that matter. And it's complex, right? Part of my dissertation work, following up on this sort of cognitive dissonance I kept experiencing as I was doing my undergraduate studies, and so I worked for 3 years in outdoor ethics with the National Wildlife Federation, and then I came to YDS and did my sort of religion ecology graduate work, trying to understand how North American faith communities and particularly biblical traditions, whether they had a basis for environmental ethics or not. And then my doctoral work, I always tell people, well, I guess I was a glutton for really digging in even deeper. I went back to Cornell from Yale and was really trying to look more closely at uh, how North American faith communities do environmental education or environmental ethics and in the ways in which they engage. And that's where a lot of my sense of how complex this is comes from. Part of what I did was to look into, 40 years worth of social science literature, and I went into this literature kicking and screaming because and honestly because another thing I was going to focus on the data. I spent a year gathering data for like news articles about religion and the environment around the country, and then there were just things missing in those days in that kind of data. It was impossible to get numbers that you needed
Uh-huh.
to do a responsible analysis, and I had to abandon that ship after
Mm,
like a year of trying, right? And I knew that there was this vast literature that most people had never found most of it, of all these little social science studies about people's religious affiliations and their environmental behaviors and attitudes and the correlations between those things. But oh my gosh, it was apples and oranges and bananas and so many different
uh-huh.
approaches and different
Yeah.
results and all this. It
Interesting.
was a total mess. So that's why I say I was dragged in kicking and screaming. But the thing that I discovered in looking through that literature was, wow, well, gosh, if anything, it looks like religion, and particularly I was more focused in the US sort of context. And my interest was, well, in the US, we have seemed to believe, at least in the environmental movement, that religion is problematic environmentally, this sort of whole dominion over the earth kind of idea. And so that's why I was, if so, what does that look like? Or if not, what does that look like? But it does look like from the social science literature, it was almost like, well, if anything, religion actually seems to be helping the cause more than it's harming the cause. There's some of these studies that said this whole dominion idea, it might exist, but it's not being reinforced by religious teaching. It's like, oh, well, that's
Hmm.
interesting. Or there's the finding that, yeah, people seem to have varying levels of wanting to engage in environmental work, but the more they attend church, the more they seem to care about the environment, even in more sort of traditional conservative religions, which really seem to cut against the idea that there was some religiously based anti-environmental strain in the US.
Hmm.
And then there was some other stuff, in the 1990s, Willett Kempton and some colleagues did this book on environmental values in America. And they just happened to ask an open-ended question of like, well, where do your environmental values come from? And they were sort of flabbergasted by the response that far and away the most popular answer was from religion and spirituality.
Hmm.
Like Americans were saying, I care about the environment for religious and spiritual reasons. And in second place, well below that religious and spiritual was for anthropocentric reasons, like, well, we care
Mm.
about humans. And then there were also the third place was biocentric reasons, which makes sense. We care about nature. But I felt like, the environmental movement was very much focused on saying that religion was bad or anthropocentrism is bad, and you've got to be biocentric, otherwise you can't care about the environment. And it's like if you actually just listen to Americans be like, well, no, I actually care about the environment because of religion,
Yeah.
spirituality, and maybe because I care about people. And so discovering things like that, I thought, well, this is more complex than I wanted. It seemed like this whole, if you will, Lynn White thesis that says, oh, this theological idea that comes from the Bible is humans think they have dominion and therefore they don't care about the environment. It just seemed more and more like a straw man kind of. First of all, it's theologically totally incoherent. That is not what dominion means. Anybody read,
Mm.
go to the stacks in the Yale Divinity School library and read all of the books in the environment and science section and tell me what percent of the theologians say anything anti-environmental about that. Almost
Mm.
0%, right?
Mm.
It's not a surprise to theologians that the Bible is not
Mm.
saying don't care about the environment, right? So that was interesting to sort of see that, even American culture more generally, there seems to be this thing that we have not appreciated and didn't expect and didn't even almost want to allow it to be possible to be true, that religion might actually be this positive source of environmental values. And I took that as, I think it was also then the results of the series of religions and ecology that Mary Evelyn and John did at Harvard in the mid to late 1990s. I remember Mary Evelyn once summarizing that whole series and saying, well, one of the big take-home messages is that the world's religions are a massive source of a well of a possible source of environmental ethics for the world's people.
Mhm.
And you can get that out of, most any major world religious tradition. There's vast and deep resources for environmental ethics. And I guess that's what I started to see. And so I was curious, well, what about those groups that don't seem to care about the environment or seem to resist it, if you will. And so I was getting invitations to more conservative, evangelical churches who had some sort of environmental thing. And what I usually encountered there was something along the following lines. They'd say, so I was working for Interfaith Power and Light. I was the founding director for Ohio Interfaith Power and Light, which is now renamed to Ohioans for Sustainable Change. And
Mm.
I got invited to a church once to speak about Ohio Interfaith Power and Light. And they asked me sort of on the side, why do you guys call it Interfaith Power and Light? Why don't you just call it Faith Power and Light? And I was trying to orient like figure out, wait, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Excuse me. And it became clear that the concern was there's often an agenda with interfaith groups that everybody's got to think of things in this way, otherwise it
Mm.
doesn't count or something like that. Where why can't we just be the people we are of faith that we are? Like
Mm.
we already care about the environment. We don't need to change our beliefs in order to care about the environment. And I heard a very interesting story from is one of the largest churches in Ohio, but it's politically complex. It's sort of like bordering towards that 50-50% of who's in that congregation, but they have an evangelical identity. And I knew someone on the staff there, staff of like 100 people in this church. And he said, yeah, about half of them are like climate change, let's do something. And half of them are climate change is a hoax. And
Mhm.
and they had a staff meeting. The senior pastor was telling me one time they had a staff meeting where some of the more environmentally enthusiastic staff were saying, let's green the church. We, insulate things and then another group was like, wait, no, what are you no, and the pastor told me, he said, I saw what was happening real quick, and I it's hard to rewind the tape on things, but he said I pretended to blow a whistle like foul, I said, hey, everybody, stop. Let's not talk
Mhm.
about it this way. He said, how about we think of it this way? And he said, we have a huge sanctuary that takes a lot of energy to heat it. We have a building that probably needs an energy audit because we can probably save $100,000 or $200,000 a year on energy alone if we can insulate the windows and the walls and caulk the windows and do some of this kinds of best practices. And if we do that, we'll be saving a lot of money that we can put towards our other ministries.
Mm.
And suddenly the people who'd been opposing this green the church thing said, oh, well, why didn't you just say that in the first place? That's a no-brainer. Of course we should do that.
Mm.
but just don't go calling it greening the church.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Right.
and as I explored this more deeply, I realized that the resistance was not to caring for God's creation at all. There's a deep and profound ethic of wanting to care for God's creation that I think is shared across almost all traditions. But joining the environmental movement or being
Mm.
called an environmentalist, like the opposition is not to doing good environmental things. The opposition is to sort of, I guess I would say, to sort of the liberal progressive approach to environmental change. I've heard that very directly as well. We want to do environmental things, but we don't want to join some environmental bandwagon.
Mhm.
I think
Mm.
that's a really important part of the complexity of the landscape that's out there, is that in most cases, it appears that religion, if anything, probably reinforces positive environmental values, or at least it should, any religion worth its salt. But culturally, it's a lot more complex than that. And
Yeah.
the same kind of culture war and political oppositions that are so polarized in the US right now are more influential than religion itself.
Mm.
It seems pretty clear, especially things like climate change. And even climate change, right, is a perfect example. I have my students, so I teach an undergrad class in religion and environmental values in America at Ohio State. And one of the weeks we look at climate change, and they look at statements from a bunch of different denominations and different religious communities about climate change. And what becomes pretty clear, there's really only one, religious denomination out there that has sort of a contrary climate change uh, statement, and it's the Southern Baptist Convention. But then there was also a movement within Southern Baptist Convention to create a Southern Baptist, environment and climate initiative
Mm.
to oppose that. And
Yeah.
former past presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention all said, we think that's really wrong. Like clearly climate change is something we should do. We don't want to be on the wrong side of history.
Mm.
So that opposition in that community, or at least a portion of that community, is like the exception that proves the rule that,
Mm.
seemingly across religious denominations, there's these calls for we got to do something about climate change. And when my students read that, they're always sort of flummoxed. They're like, "What?" They were really assuming that there'd be all these sort of
Yeah.
"we don't care about climate change" sort of statements coming from religious communities, and it's the
Yeah.
opposite of that. And yet the next thing they'll ask is, "Well, then why aren't we doing more about it?" How come our legislators, who are members of all these religious communities, don't actually seem to care about,
Mm.
well, that's
Right.
politics. That's a political question. So I think that the overlap between political affiliations and then religious identities is a very complex space. They always say, don't talk about religion and politics in polite company. And I tell my students on the first day of class, like, well, good thing we're not polite company. We're collegial company.
Mhm.
And our whole point here at the university is let's try to understand
Right.
various sides of the way that people look at things. So I
Yeah.
think that's part of what I see of what's going on is, I mean, the other piece of this is, um, just internationally. I was part of a series of conferences in Iceland that were part of the launching pad for the UN Environment Program's Faith for Nature program. And it was really great to see faith communities coming from all the continents, coming together, having sort of global conversations about what's the role of religion in dealing with the environment. And at the time, a lot of that was uh, predicated on, from the UN's perspective, from UNEP's perspective, that a lot of faith communities are trying to engage in this space, but don't have the organizing or the environmental expertise to really know what are the next steps. Meanwhile, a lot of development agencies and NGOs are in this space and don't have the connections they need, that have the cultural capital or that work with local communities in the way that faith communities do. And it sure would be nice to broker more networks and connections and alliances between faith communities and all the other communities working on sustainable development and other environmental projects. And I think that's a really keen sign of an evolution over time. The other place I've seen it is, I went from working at the National Wildlife Federation in the 1990s, where the idea of religion and the environment was catching on with a small group that would sort of meet and talk about this, but everybody else looked at you like, "What are you crazy?" Unless it was some Native American thing, religion is the problem. It was still sort of very strong out there. Well, over the next 10, 20 years, it became very clear that most of America's environmental nonprofit groups figured out that, oh, wait, religion is an ally, and really started to move towards how can we connect with and partner with faith communities in our environmental initiatives. And then the scientific and professional societies followed suit. And so I was a part of a lot of the work that the Ecological Society of America did to foster dialogue between ecologists and religion. And so I see that as a progressive movement across not just the United States, but even more globally, is that the level of the amount of leadership that faith communities and religions are providing to environmental movements and questions and organizations is something that's continued to grow. But the political situation is just as complex or frustrating as ever. And so I think we have, I was going to say in some ways it's almost like a little bit of a David and Goliath sort of situation. I think there's a lot of faith community voices and religious voices that are working on issues of, environmental justice and just care for creation and climate change and things like that. But there's a lot of powerful entities that profit from the current way things are done, and stand in the way of that kind of messaging.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's maybe the situation we're in. So
Yeah.
I think it's complex. Like even my own, I've participated in the Columbus Diocese, Catholic Diocese creation care team for a number of years, as a member of that diocese, but more as an Ohio State sort of person on the committee. And following Laudato Si, this is a big change. I used to get a lot more resistance from colleagues who would say, "Wait, are you allowed to teach about religion and the environment?
Mm.
Aren't you supposed to be doing science?" But now my sort of ecologist and environmental science colleagues will say, well, even the Pope wrote a book about the environment now. So,
Uh-huh.
I mean, my gosh, I guess it must be religion must care about the environment now. But after Laudato Si, the Columbus Diocese just had an amazing creation care team for, 5 years there. And I think you would have had to place us in the top five or the top 10 dioceses in the country in terms of environmental initiatives, all kinds of stuff. They went through and did energy efficiency in all of the buildings and all of the schools and all the parishes in the diocese and won an award from our local utility for energy champions. And there's an organic farm as part of the diocese, and there's retreats they were doing and educational things and advocacy, all kinds of stuff at so multiple kinds of levels. But then over the next multiple years, there were a bunch of leadership changes and restructurings, and kind of no sense that was something that needed to be championed, and instead, it felt what felt like a return to something more traditional, if you will, and it kind of took the wind out of the sails, or at least took away some of the support and the infrastructure that was helping a lot of that creation care work happen.
Mhm.
And I look at that, and I think that that's actually fairly common among faith communities, that there are these moments where a denomination or a local community will do all this environmental stuff and then kind of run into obstacles or barriers. Maybe they're political, maybe they're just timing, maybe there are other issues that are drawing attention away. And
Mhm.
then
Right.
environmental care sort of recedes into the background a little bit. And I think that's sort of like waves on the shore, kind of get back and
Mm.
forth sometimes. It's, exactly how the sand on the beach is shifting is still to be
Right.
seen.
Right.
So I don't
Yeah.
know. It's more complex than I can honestly
Yeah,
pretend
no.
to understand.
It's so, yeah, so much fascinating complexity and subtlety and kind of layers of different forces happening at the same time and pushing and
Yeah.
pulling in different ways and over time. So thank you so much for kind of exploring some of that. And um, so we just have a few minutes left here. So I'm wondering maybe if we can kind of just focus for the last few minutes on sort of looking ahead towards sort of for the field of religion and ecology,
Yeah.
both kind of as an academic field, but also in, nonprofits or in religious communities in the world more generally, kind of what are sort of key questions that you see us being faced with, key challenges or opportunities in growing this kind of um, religiously or spiritually sustained environmental ethic and action.
Yeah, thanks. Well, here, that's another big question that I can only sort of answer maybe from my slice of what I see, but I've been thinking for a long time that what's really important for religion and ecology is less to do with all the things that we might say about how religion and ecology could matter. And I've often been a lot more interested in trying to discern, what plays in Peoria, what actually is motivating people within values communities
Hmm.
to engage in and work in environmentally, if you will, because that's what will carry us through tough times. I did some surveying of faith communities in Ohio back around the late 2020 aughts, around 2009, 2010, and at the time that was when the cap and trade bill almost passed as federal legislation. And then there was sort of a lot of despair and a lot of questions around changing messaging and all this sort of thing. But what some of the study showed us was that the most reliable and most resonant messages, especially with faith communities, remained sort of the bread and butter ethical moral questions about stewardship or environmental justice, if you will. And that you could talk about green jobs, you could talk about all the other ways that you maybe talk about this. And yet, what really seems to resonate with our values communities are the basic moral messages. Back to my middle schooler intuitions, like it's just wrong that
Hmm.
this is not fair, that the
Yeah.
poor and vulnerable suffer disproportionately. So I don't think we want to give up on the basic things that really just are the most key sort of moral issues around environmental questions. I don't think we should chase after the latest way of saying everything or whatever it is. Like these are still perennial, human moral issues
Mm-hmm.
that we have to focus on. And there's a sense that I have that in some ways, faith communities in the United States, particularly, maybe the sign of the times is faith communities have not done a good enough job of providing moral leadership. Moral leadership. It's almost like, well, policy or science will show us what we need to do and we'll just do it and everything will be fine. We'll fix it. And in some ways, it's like, well, you can't leave out the moral dimensions of those equations and you have to make moral distinctions. And so I kind of think being true to being a faith community, what do faith communities do? Faith communities, I don't think should just be sort of the spiritual arm of the environmental movement, and doing whatever
Yeah.
the environmental movement wants to do. And well, the faith community can come in and kind of hold signs and make sure that we get the policies we want. I don't really think that's the most important thing for religion and ecology. I think what would be more important if religion would be what religion is. If religion is a place where people become whole, if it's a place that provides healing, if it's a place where things are reconciled, if it's a place where we can become better human beings, maybe healed and better human beings are the kind of human beings that have a better chance of healing and reconciling things planetarily or environmentally or ecologically. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's really important. And maybe the last thing I'll say is it strikes me that particularly in the West and in the US, we are so disconnected from the natural world. We are so disconnected from God's creation. And that was true, when I was in college. There were studies out there that the primary ways that Americans related to nature were like going to the zoo, watching nature shows on television, and going for drives in the country, all of which are
Yeah.
lovely things to do. But what about actually being outside and getting your fingers dirty, kind of a thing? These days, here's my smartphone, right? We have all this concern over the phone-based generation, or, smartphone-based childhoods, and people are more anxious and more depressed. And it seems like an antidote to that is actually precisely reconnecting to the natural world or to God's creation, if you will, and to ourselves and to our own bodies. And I think that there's sort of an embedded spirituality in our relationship to others. Humans are very relational, and that includes not just our relationship to people, but our relationship to all things. The delight that children have in connecting to creatures and birds and whatever else it might be. And I think there's some very natural sources there for the kind of spiritual growth that and healing and reconciliation that is just good for humans. And if it's good for humans, maybe it might be good for the planet. Because you know what? This is still true. People are more motivated to do something about care for creation because of their spirituality, their religion, or even their own care for humans. And yes, we also care about nature itself, but unless we foster more relationships with all of that, that care is not as likely to overcome the other forces in the world. So
Mm,
I think it's a call to soaking into ourselves. Maybe it's a call to sort of, if you will, it's like that Sabbath rest. If we're so busy all the time trying to save the environment, we will become exhausted. And and maybe what's the line? Pope Francis early on in Laudato Si has this line where he's talking about Saint Francis, and he's talking about, well, St. Paul as well. It's something like, rather than a problem to be solved, the world is a joyful mystery
mm,
to be contemplated with gladness and praise. And
mm,
I think that brings me back to just your basic orientation to life. Life is a gift. This creation of which we're a part is a gift. And the most appropriate response to a gift is thanks,
yeah.
thanksgiving and praise. And if we're so dead set, like everything's wrong, we got to fix everything, we got to fix everything, that's not the fundamental thing that's going on. The most important thing that's going on is that life is a gift, and we should be thankful for that. And if we open up our hearts in gratitude, if we allow ourselves to be a little bit more healed, then this fixing things that are actually already okay, like, the earth will be
Mm,
fine
mm,
without us. Yeah. But maybe we can kind of take some cues from how beautiful and wonderful things already are. And then that, I think, becomes a more natural source for really caring to preserve and protect the things that are so dear to us because they're such beautiful and gracious gifts. And that sounds more like religion and spirituality to me than the latest campaign about, what phrase shall we put on our sign?
mhm.
That kind of thing can actually motivate a really effective advocacy. That can motivate
Yeah.
effective programs. But I think we get too caught up in trying to do everything, and we forget to just be who we really are. And I think when we can sink into those relationships and be thankful for the very things that have made us, that maybe becomes a source of resilience, a source of perseverance, a source of hope. And I think that's something that we desperately need, and particularly in these times. So to me, that's the direction I'd like to see things tend, is towards those
Yeah.
very hopeful and healing aspects of our relationships in this work and
Yeah.
with the life that's around us.
Mm.